folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria, of course. Now, I have been one of the people who has championed the spreading of the awareness of the fact that swords in most historical periods have been secondary or sometimes even tertiary weapons. That is, they're usually not the first weapon of most soldiers. What I mean by that, of course, as any of my regular viewers will know by now because I mentioned this numerous times throughout many of my videos, is that fundamentally the primary weapons of most soldiers are either usually pole weapons, that is spears, halberds, bills, things like this, or indeed they're missile weapons such as guns, bows, crossbows, or indeed manning something like a cannon or a catapult or something along these lines. However, I have noticed increasingly people have taken this idea on board, and it's now widely known and widely understood, but people are taking it a little bit too far. What I mean by that is, whilst for most soldiers in pretty much any period of warfare, the primary weapon was not a sword, there are exceptions to that. There are types of soldier and officer throughout history who have had swords as a primary weapon, and that is for a number of reasons. Now, I'm holding here one possible reason why a sword can be a primary weapon is because it is essentially a pole weapon, a pole arm, okay? And obviously if you have a sword that's this big, then it can compete on a level playing field with pole weapons, and of course you can use it against pole weapons, and in its own right it will match up against those. However, there are other swords that are carried as primary weapons, or at least don't have other hand weapons as a primary weapon, for very specific reasons. Most famously so, light cavalry. Light cavalry will often use forms of, certainly in the sort of industrial age, will use forms of usually curved light sabres. And in fact, if we look right the way across history, whether it be right back into the sort of crusading era of the Middle Ages, or indeed if we look at the 16th, 17th centuries in places like Hungary and Poland, or Russia, or indeed if you look at the Napoleonic period and into the 19th century, and in some places even into the 20th century, curved light sabres used by light cavalry on horseback for quick hit and run actions, charging in on quick horses, lightly equipped, slashing up enemy, particularly things like gun emplacements, this kind of thing, or fleeing infantry. The sword is very, very good at that. If you're charging into a group of people with the aim of causing lots of either fatal or non-fatal injuries and then riding off again, the sword is very, very effective at that. One-on-one against lancers, it might not be very effective. One-on-one against a spearman, it might not be very effective. But if you're a body of lightly equipped and fast-moving cavalry, the sabre is a really good weapon for that. Now, there are other exceptions. Another one, think about sailors. Okay, what are sailors famous for using? Cutlasses. It's basically like the sabre, but usually has bigger hand protection than at least most of the earlier sabres do. That is because in close boarding actions, where you're very close up to the opponent, you want a shorter blade. It's quite a sturdy, heavy weapon, focused on cutting and thrusting, of course, and with a lot of hand protection that you could potentially hit with, but primarily it's there to protect your hand. And cutlasses, very, very popular in boarding actions, right the way through the 16th, 17th, all the way to the 20th century, because of course it's very good in close quarters. And incidentally, this would connect to trench fighting as well. If we're looking at the weapons that were popular used in trench fighting, obviously we don't find long weapons like spears used in trench warfare because they would be too unwieldy. Same thing on board ship, whether you're on the deck of the ship or below decks in a ship, you're limited in space. There's rigging, there's your other fellow sailors around you, so you want a short, close-in weapon that's almost at punching range that you can cut and stab with, and grab and stab and do all of this kind of stuff very close up. And very, very good weapon. One-on-one against a bayonet, yeah, the person with the bayonet's going to have an advantage, but that's not what this is for. They did have boarding pikes, incidentally, essentially a type of spear that was popularly used in boarding actions in the 18th and 19th centuries. And they were used for one specific type of thing, and cutlasses were used for another specific type of thing. So for close-in action, cutlass is very, very practical. And of course, remember that a sailor, most of the time, has to have their hands free. They might have a firearm, they might be climbing over things, through things, up rigging, whatever. They might be rowing a boat, so they need to have their hands free. So the cutlass as their primary sidearm, very, very practical weapon to have. Next thing to mention is armoured people. As soon as you bring armour, particularly heavy armour, if we're talking about the era of plate, when people are wearing helmets like this Sallet and like my plate harness, in that situation, swords become super useful again, because whilst spears and poleaxes are usually the primary weapons of knights, should we call them, or men-at-arms, in fact, often it seems that swords were their primary weapons as well, and there's a very good reason for that, and that is if you're wearing full plate harness, you become, your ability to close distance is hugely magnified. So essentially you become invulnerable to a lot of long range attacks. So actually getting in close and half swording and grappling and trying to throw your opponent and grab and disarm and stab and all this kind of stuff at very close range, it's a little bit similar in a way to the sailor fighting at close quarters with the cutlass. In that situation, this weapon suddenly becomes far more useful than it would be if you were unarmoured. Okay, so in an unarmoured situation, the person with the spear has a huge advantage. If we have armour on, then the person with the spear doesn't have such a big advantage anymore, because essentially if I keep my openings, my armpits and any opening in my helmet covered and close in distance, suddenly you know, some of their stabs will just glance off my armour. Suddenly I'm at a huge advantage when I'm in close range with a half sword, because I've now got greater leverage up close and I've got a weapon that's able to stab and offend in much more ways than a spear can at that distance. So the longsword or any other sword in full armour can be a primary weapon, and it seems often was. Finally, oh, it's not finally actually, there's going to be two, this is penultimately, the other one is a sword used with a pistol, and officers very often use these. Now, if you're an officer, I've grabbed a cutlass here, but imagine it's an officer's sabre. You know I have lots of those, it's just that this was to hand. If I have a sword in one hand and a pistol in the other, I'm actually as a unit, I'm a very, very effective fighting person. But additionally, if I'm commanding troops, I don't want to be encumbered with a musket with a bayonet on the end. Some sergeants in the 18th century and 17th century carried things like spontoons and even halberds and partisans, but by the 19th century it became more typical for officers and indeed sergeants in some situations to have a sword and a pistol, because that of course means I can engage opponents at close and medium range with a pistol, and at close range I've still got something to defend myself and fight with. And indeed in close quarters, I'm debatably, with a pistol and a sword, I'm now a more effective, or at least as effective, fighting member of the team as someone with the musket and the bayonet is, because they've got a bayonet, I've got a sword and a pistol. And indeed, once of course multi-shot pistols came along, either double-barrel pistols or revolvers, then I become a very effective close quarters fighting member of the team. So that's another situation where, as far as the hand-to-hand combat is concerned, the sword is my primary weapon. You could say the pistol's the primary weapon, but really they work in unison. The two things work together. So there's another example of where the sword is, in a way, the primary weapon. And finally, there is another situation where the sword in the medieval period and many other periods, in fact, whether we go all the way back to Roman legionaries, or we come all the way forward to 19th century Afghans and Indian people, where the sword is and can be a legitimate primary weapon, and that's when you couple it with a shield. As soon as you bring a shield into play, the benefits of pole weapons gets nullified by the shield itself. So many people, when I've said, oh, you know, swords are usually a secondary or tertiary weapon, have gone, Matt, what about Romans? And you're exactly right. You're exactly right that the Romans, really, you could say, yes, they had pilums. Yes, in the earlier period, they had the spear, the long spear. But most famously, they used the gladius. And they did really use the gladius as a primary weapon, but always coupled with a shield. As soon as you have a shield, particularly large shields, it completely changes the nature of the game. And this large shield, you could really say the shield is the primary weapon, if we class this as a weapon. And it is really. And so in the Roman era, they went, okay, we're looking at pike blocks. How do we nullify these pike blocks we're fighting against, these phalanxes? Well, you use a large shield. If you have a large shield and you get behind it, you're able to close into a distance where the sword is now a far better weapon than the spear or the pike. And so in that situation, yes, indeed, the sword really is a primary weapon when coupled with the shield. And we see that in India in the 19th century, we see that across the ages, we see that in the Norman and Viking eras, the crusading eras. Yes, indeed, the sword can be a primary weapon and can compete against things like spears when it's coupled with a large shield, and only when it's coupled with a large shield really. As soon as we take the shield away and any armour away, the sword is not a match for the spear. In an unarmoured fight, one-on-one, sword versus spear, the spear usually wins, and even more than that, I would say wins about 5 times to 1. Okay. However, when we're talking about either bringing armour into the situation, into the equation, or shields into the equation, then the sword can become a better weapon because it enables you to close that distance with the spearman or the polearm user, or indeed someone shooting at you with a bow or a crossbow. It enables you to close that distance to a range at which your sword now becomes a better weapon. So there we go, folks. I hope I've illustrated that whilst I do adhere to my basic comment that swords are usually, for most soldiers throughout history, a secondary or a tertiary weapon, there are many exceptions to that. The exceptions being when you make the sword massive, like the massive Zweihander, or when you introduce armour, and armour enables you to close the range so that swords become more effective than some pole weapons. For light cavalry, for hit and run tactics, where you want to wound as many as people as, or potentially kill as many people as possible and then ride off, so you could say in a sense the horse is actually the primary weapon, but swords are very important there. Where it's coupled with something in your other hand, such as a pistol, or indeed, most famously, the shield, or when, and this again comes to distance and range, with cutlasses where you're in close quarters and you can't really wield polearms very effectively. So there are lots of situations where the sword does effectively become the primary weapon again. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.